As parents, we all want to give, but when we know how to keep a little for ourselves, we can truly be there to love them longer. In the late days of winter, as a gray sky covered the peaceful Vermont countryside, where bare branches patiently awaited spring, a small house on the outskirts seemed to hold the last breath of silence. Snow lingered on the porch steps, where children's laughter once echoed. Today, only the sound of the wind gently whistling through the old wooden window frame remained, and inside the small room, an elderly woman was carefully packing sweaters and books into an old suitcase. Mrs. Eleanor, 78 years old. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, her wrinkled skin marked by the years of a lifetime. Gentle yet firm. She used to be an elementary school teacher, a dedicated woman loved by generations of students. Her whole life, she lived for her family, for the children, both in the classroom and in her own home. Her three children, now grown, lived in different places. But for the past 4 years, Mrs. Eleanor had been living with her eldest son, David, in a more comfortable house in the suburbs. That morning, the kitchen was unusually quiet. No sound of spoons clinking against bowls, no sound of coffee dripping as usual. Only the soft sound of suitcase wheels rolling on the wooden floor, and the sigh of a mother preparing to leave what seemed like home, but had long ceased to be a true home. Her eldest son, rushing off to work, only managed to say, "Call if you need anything, Mom," and slammed the door shut. Not a goodbye, not even a hug. Mrs. Eleanor just stood silently, her hand lightly touching the old scarf her daughter-in-law had given her during her first winter there. Though they weren't particularly close, it was a well-intentioned gift. She kept it, as if holding on to a fragile hope that she belonged there. Yet today she was leaving, not out of anger, nor entirely out of sadness, but because after many quiet days she realized something. Love doesn't mean staying in a place where you are no longer seen, no longer heard. I raised my children with all my love, but love doesn't mean staying in a place where people no longer see you. That sentence echoed in her heart, like a self-reminder, a slow but decisive alarm clock. Perhaps at this age one doesn't need much, just to feel that one still exists, still has meaning. But presence sometimes doesn't come from being adequately cared for, but from small things: a shared meal with laughter, a concerned question, a grateful glance. During the 4 years living with David, Mrs. Eleanor initially thought she was helping her son, looking after the grandchildren, cooking, maintaining the family routine. But gradually everything became silent. Conversations grew sparse. Dinners quickly ended, with eyes glued to phones. On holidays, she often sat alone on the porch, watching the snow fall and reminiscing about when the children were young, gathered together, singing Christmas carols by the fireplace. Once she tried to tell her daughter-in-law a funny story from her teaching days, but before she could finish, the other person smiled politely, went into the study and said, "Mom, let me finish this report, okay?" And so she kept the story to herself. No one intentionally hurt her, but sometimes thoughtlessness doesn't come from malice, but from a life lived too hastily. Her children had their own families, their own responsibilities, and she understood that. But understanding didn't mean it didn't hurt. One evening after clearing the table, she quietly poured herself a cup of tea. The dim yellow light shone on the family photo hanging on the wall, a photo hardly anyone noticed anymore. Looking at it, she suddenly felt estranged. The woman in the photo, the always smiling mother, seemed forgotten. That night she couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, she thought of her old house, the small wooden house nestled in the hills, where she and her husband had lived for nearly 40 years. Though run down, though no one was beside her, every corner there held memories, familiar sounds, and above all, freedom. Freedom to be herself. Freedom to live her final days without shrinking into silence. The next morning, as the first faint rays of spring sunlight peeked through the window, Mrs. Eleanor woke up early as usual. But this time, she didn't make coffee, didn't bake bread. She took the suitcase out of the closet and began packing. Not much, just the essentials. A few warm clothes, favorite books, the family photo frame, and the small diary she always kept with her. Each item felt like a piece of memory. She didn't cry. Her eyes only stung slightly as if the cold wind outside had crept into the heart of someone used to enduring. When the taxi stopped at the gate, the driver got out, intending to help her with the luggage. But she raised her hand, smiled faintly. I'm still strong enough to carry a part of my life myself. The door closed. The house fell silent again, as if Mrs. Eleanor's footsteps had never been there. But this time, the silence no longer made her feel lost. It felt like liberation. She was returning, not just to the old house, but to herself. Welcome to Senior Talks, where we tell real stories, gentle yet profound, from elderly people who have journeyed through almost a whole life. So you can pause, listen, and understand more about things that seem all too familiar. In today's journey, we will explore 5 heart-touching lessons drawn from the moving story of Mrs. Eleanor, an elderly mother who sacrificed everything for her children, only to realize one day she herself had been forgotten. But instead of resentment, she learned to let go, heal, and find herself again. And then miraculously, just as she let go, her children found their way back. Let's begin with the first lesson. Do not live with married children. There are things that seem small but accumulate over time into an unnameable distance. There are people who walk around us every day, exchanging simple greetings, yet their hearts have drifted apart. Who knows since when? Mrs. Eleanor didn't leave that house because of arguments. No harsh words were spoken, but the silence itself was the clearest reminder. She no longer held her former place in the lives of her loved ones. When Mrs. Eleanor moved in with her eldest son's family, Andrew, it was a completely natural decision. 4 years earlier, when her husband passed away, her children were worried. She was 74, her heart wasn't as strong as it used to be, and her hands trembled occasionally, signaling something to come. Everyone wanted to take care of Mom. Among the 3 children, Andrew was the most stable, with a gentle wife, 2 well-behaved children, and a comfortable house on the edge of town. And so she moved in. Initially, everything was warm. She was the earliest riser in the house. Every morning, the smell of toast and hot coffee wafted from the kitchen. The little ones clung to her, calling Grandma with never-ending excitement. Her daughter-in-law, Lily, seemed reserved at first but tried to be polite, tried to yield everything to her. And Andrew was always a thoughtful son, never forgetting to ask, "Are you tired, Mom?" when he came home from work, or, "What would you like to eat, Mom? I'll tell Lily to cook it." But time passed. Small details began to emerge, and they weren't as small as people thought. Lily preferred bland food, while Mrs. Eleanor was used to richer flavors since marrying. Every evening meal had a silent moment when someone tried to eat something not to their taste, or tried to hide a frown because it was too salty, too bland, too much onion. She didn't blame Lily. Being a daughter-in-law was tiring enough, let alone cooking for someone with different tastes. She felt uneasy, but said nothing. Her granddaughter, little Emily, was only 8, but already accustomed to the modern pace of life. When Grandma told fairy tales, the child turned on her tablet to listen to music. When Grandma wanted to take her to the park, she preferred watching TikTok. Once, when she reminded Emily not to spend too much time on the device, Andrew said, "Kids these days are like that, Mom. Don't worry too much." The words were gentle, but they felt like a cold breeze against the back of her neck. Then came the sleepless nights. She was used to staying up late from her teaching days. Grading papers until 1 a.m. was common. At Andrew's house, the living room lights automatically turned off at 10 p.m., like a rule. She wanted to sit a little longer, read, or even just listen to old music. But Lily's fleeting glance when she turned on the light, then the sound of soft footsteps coming downstairs as if checking, made her feel like a stranger. The TV was another matter. Andrew liked watching football, while she preferred old black and white movies. Once, while she was halfway through To Kill a Mockingbird, Andrew walked in, picked up the remote, and said, "Mom, you've been watching since this afternoon. Let me have a turn, okay?" He smiled, meaning no harm, but she silently stood up, poured herself a glass of water, and went upstairs. That feeling, the feeling of just borrowing space in her child's home, gradually became constant. The kitchen was the clearest indicator of change. For 50 years, she had been the woman of the kitchen, She knew the place of every spoon, how to keep the broth clear, how to keep the dish towels smelling of lavender. But at Andrew's house, everything was already arranged. Lily had a dishwasher, blender, juicer. Every time she entered the kitchen, she felt like she was disrupting someone else's order. Once she wanted to make her traditional roast for the family, but Lily had already ordered food online that afternoon. She wrapped her disappointment in a plastic container, put it in the fridge, and only said one sentence. "Try it sometime, dear." No one treated her badly. No one raised their voice. No one forgot her birthday or Christmas wishes. But every silence, every "maybe tomorrow, Mom," every "I'm a bit busy right now," fell like steady drops into her heart. One day she wandered around the house all morning and no one asked, "Have you eaten yet, Mom?" Not because they were thoughtless, just that everyone had their own lives. And so, one late winter afternoon, while Andrew and Lily were at work and the children at school, she stood before the wardrobe and took out the old suitcase. It was the suitcase her husband used to carry whenever they traveled when they were young. She folded each sweater inside, along with some old photos, some old books read until memorized, and a Japanese ceramic teapot her husband had given her. When Andrew came home, she had finished packing. He was stunned. "Mom, where are you going?" Lily walked in, saw the suitcase, and bombarded her with questions. She just smiled, sat down on the chair, and gently replied, "I'm going home." "Which home?" "You live here, Mom." Andrew frowned. The children watched from afar, not understanding what was happening. Mrs. Eleanor said softly, "My old house, the one with the wildflower garden, where your father used to repaint the front door every spring, where I know every creak of the floorboards, every corner where sunlight slants through in the afternoon." Lily sat down beside her. "I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable. We really want you here." She placed her hand on Lily's, still calm. "I know. No one did anything wrong. It's just that I don't belong here anymore. I'm no longer needed in the way I used to be." Those words plunged the room into silence. Not an argument, not a word of blame, but that very fact made it more heartbreaking. The next morning she left. Andrew wanted to drive her back to the old house, but she refused. She wanted to take the bus, like in the old days when she used to teach. She sat near the window, the cold wind blowing through the thin glass, but her heart felt light. She looked at the bare trees outside, thinking, they are waiting for spring. So am I. Arriving home, the old house was the same. Peeling paint, a faint musty smell, a few dry branches fallen onto the porch roof. But she wasn't afraid. This was where she used to be herself. And now she would be herself again, even if alone. And then new days began. No one woke her up early. No sound of children's feet running on the floor. No laughter, no loud TV. But also no longer the feeling of being out of sync with someone else's life. She made her own coffee, read her books, listened to the radio, watered flowers, wrote letters by hand. Sometimes the wind whistled through the door crack, making her shiver slightly. But she smiled. Freedom sometimes costs loneliness, but at least it was a choice. She didn't leave because she wasn't loved, but because love was no longer the connecting thread it once was. She understood that love isn't enough to keep someone somewhere when the feeling of being needed has departed. Lesson 2. Do not interfere deeply in your children's family matters. You've probably heard the saying, when children are small, mom is the whole world. But when they grow up, mom is just a part of their world. That saying echoes a gentle yet poignant truth for many parents. Some affections seem unchanging, but their expression needs to adapt to avoid becoming barriers. The second lesson in Mrs. Eleanor's journey is a quiet but profound example of this. The lesson of not interfering deeply in children's family matters, even when love remains intact. After leaving her eldest son's house, where she felt like a shadow amidst crowded silence, Mrs. Eleanor didn't return to her old house as everyone thought. Instead, she moved in with her youngest daughter, a single mother raising a young child. Many in the family thought this would be an ideal arrangement, an experienced elder living alongside a young, still uncertain mother, one needing a place for rest, the other needing daily help. However, this harmony didn't last long. Eleanor had always been a devoted mother. Since her children were young, she was accustomed to arranging, caring for, deciding everything from meals to clothes. This habit became part of her maternal instinct, a reflex requiring no thought. So witnessing her daughter, now a mother herself, struggling with raising a young child, she couldn't sit idly by. She began offering advice, initially gentle suggestions like, "You should put the baby to sleep a bit earlier," or "Maybe you should give the baby less sugar." These seemingly harmless suggestions gradually became the source of silent distances. Her daughter didn't react harshly, but her eyes slowly changed. Polite nods replaced intimate sharing. Every time she spoke, her daughter sighed. Soon, light phrases that landed heavily in her heart began to appear. "Mom, I know you're worried, but I'm a mother too. I know what to do." Increasingly, Eleanor felt disappointed. She couldn't understand why her daughter reacted this way. Wasn't she just trying to help? Hadn't she raised 3 children, including her? She thought, if only her own mother had taught her bit by bit like this back then, perhaps things would have been easier. But times change. People change. Eleanor's way of loving, correct and effective in another era, now seemed rigid in a home needing flexibility and respect. Conflict erupted when Eleanor, after many restless nights, decided to take her grandchild to the doctor. She had noticed for a long time signs that worried her. The child was very active, almost never sat still for long, always interrupted, and struggled to focus when reminded. These signs made her suspect her grandchild might have an issue, possibly a mild form of hyperactivity, something she believed couldn't be delayed. But instead of discussing it with her daughter first, she acted on her familiar instinct, quietly arranging everything. When her daughter found out, it was an evening filled with silence. Not a single argument, no raised voices, but her daughter's eyes were enough to make Eleanor feel she had done something unforgivable. That evening, no one finished their dinner. After putting the child to sleep, she turned back to her mother with red-rimmed eyes. "You don't trust me, do you? You think I'm not capable of being a mother, right?" Eleanor couldn't answer. In that moment, she realized all excuses would be meaningless. It was true she only wanted what was best for her grandchild, but she forgot there are boundaries in mature love that she had no right to cross. She hadn't trusted her daughter, not as a child, but as a mother doing her best to raise her own child. A few days later, her daughter took her to a small nursing home in the suburbs. She said perhaps they both needed time to rethink things. Eleanor didn't blame her. On the way to the nursing home, she looked out the car window, silent. The scenery blurred past her eyes. She didn't cry, but her heart felt a little colder. The days in the nursing home passed quietly. Every morning, she sat on the balcony watching the sunlight filter through the leaves. Every afternoon, she reread old books, listened to music tied to her memories. Sometimes she saw herself in her roommates, also mothers, grandmothers, who had spent their lives loving children and grandchildren, but then had to learn to let go when the time came. One afternoon, sitting with her old diary, she wrote a short but heart-heavy line. Being a mother for a lifetime doesn't mean being right for a lifetime. It was the first time she admitted to herself that her love, however vast, could still be misguided. Eleanor understood that love needs to be expressed through listening and respect, not through the imposition of experience. She remembered her daughter's words, "Mom, I'm a mother too." That phrase, which had hurt her before, now echoed like an awakening bell. Yes, she was a mother too, and she needed to be trusted, just as Eleanor herself had wished for when she was her daughter's age. Her time in the nursing home wasn't long, but enough for Eleanor to reconsider everything. She gradually understood that help is only truly meaningful when it is welcome. Otherwise, it becomes a burden, even an insult to the recipient. There are things parents think are loving, but in the child's eyes appear as interference, as silent judgment. Love, she realized, also needs space to breathe, to grow on its own, to be allowed to exist in a way appropriate for the time. When her daughter came back to pick her up, neither spoke of the past. But in her firm handshake, Mrs. Eleanor felt something had changed. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps a silent thank you for giving each other space to understand again. On the way back home this time, Eleanor didn't ask questions, didn't offer suggestions, didn't worry excessively as before. She just looked at her grandchild sleeping soundly in the back seat and smiled. She knew she was still a mother, but now she chose to be a mother differently, taking a step back so her daughter could step forward, listening more than speaking, loving with a conscious distance, yet never far from the heart. Eleanor understood that sometimes the best thing a mother can do for her child isn't offering advice, but standing quietly behind, ready when needed, and silent when the child is learning to walk on their own. Because true love always requires enough space for both to be themselves, without judgment, without imposition, only gentle trust like the late afternoon sun, warm enough to comfort, but not burn. That story, seemingly just a conflict between generations, is actually a profound picture of boundaries in love. A mother learned to love her child again in the way the child needed, not the way she was accustomed to. And that, perhaps, is one of the most difficult yet beautiful things in the lifelong journey of motherhood. Lesson 3. Do not hold money for your children. Some things seem small, yet shatter people's hearts. A coin, lifeless, cold, but when placed in a mother's hand, it's more than just material value. It carries trust, entrustment, affection between generations. But sometimes, precisely because she embraces too much love, a mother can inadvertently become the name that shakes the whole family. And Eleanor, who once thought that if she just did right, loved enough, sacrificed enough, everything would be fine, realized kindness also needs limits. And money, if not handled clearly, will destroy the most sacred things. It happened when Mrs. Eleanor had been retired for a few years, no longer working as a nurse, but still quite lucid, capable of organizing papers and managing savings for her 3 children. They didn't live close by, each in a different state, living their own lives. But they shared one commonality: absolute trust in their mother. The eldest daughter sent her money saved for her first daughter's college fund. The youngest son asked her to keep his bonus money so he wouldn't spend it wastefully. And the middle son, a busy businessman with ups and downs, also frequently sent money home for Mom to hold, saying, "Mom, you're the most trustworthy living safe in my life." Eleanor didn't say it, but she was proud. In her twilight years, when her body was no longer strong and she couldn't help her children with labor, she saw holding their money as proof of her necessity. She felt useful, trusted, still the center holding the family rhythm. Every month she carefully recorded, tracked each amount, marked clearly. She thought if anything happened to her one day, outsiders could rely on this to return the money to the right person without error. However, things are never as simple as a mother thinks. One spring day, as the trees in her yard were just sprouting new leaves, Eleanor received a call from her middle son. His voice was slightly rushed, a bit excited, somewhat secretive. "Mom, I have an opportunity to invest in a small project with some old friends. They're developing a health tech app. I see great potential, but I need to contribute capital soon. Can you send me 20,000? I'll pay it back soon, definitely." Eleanor hesitated slightly. That amount was part of the total sum her eldest daughter and youngest son had also sent, but the middle son emphasized that it would only take a few weeks to recoup the investment. Eleanor thought if she didn't tell the other two, it would be fine, as long as everything went smoothly. Besides, she knew her son had succeeded in many projects before. She believed this time would be the same. She transferred the money, not entirely because she fully trusted the deal, but because she trusted her child, trusting he wouldn't do anything to disappoint her. But life doesn't operate on love, but on truth. And the truth was, the deal failed after a few months. The app couldn't raise a second round of funding. The investing friends withdrew one by one. The money was gone. Initially, Eleanor hid it. She thought she could cover it with her retirement funds. But when her eldest daughter called asking for the college money, she had no choice but to confess. The silence on the other end of the line made her breathless. "Mom, you used my money to lend to him without asking me?" Her daughter's voice faltered. Before she could explain, the youngest son, upon learning the story, also became angry. "Mom, you're not a referee, you're Mom. But you're not allowed to pick sides. Why do you always cover for the middle brother?" Eleanor had never seen her children argue over money, but this time, it wasn't just about money, it was about trust, fairness, the feeling of being slighted within the family. One small action, One instance of favoritism, and everything collapsed. In the following days, calls became less frequent. Messages stopped. Every family gathering became awkward. The middle son carried guilty eyes while the other two maintained a reproachful distance. Eleanor lived through days of torment. Every night, listening to the wind outside, she remembered the eyes of each child when they were small. When they argued, she was always the mediator. When they fell, she was the first to embrace them. But now she, the mother who thought she was the anchor, had become the reason for the rift in family affection. She wrote in her diary with a trembling hand, "Mom held the money wanting to hold the family together. Who knew it would break it?" That line pierces the reader's heart, because so many mothers have been like that, holding money, not out of greed for power, not wanting control, but simply for a very human reason, fearing the child wouldn't know how to save, fearing they'd spend thoughtlessly, fearing mom couldn't help when they needed it. But that very foresight, if not transparent, becomes a barrier between blood relatives. Eleanor began tidying everything up. She gathered all papers related to the funds, carefully noted down the origin, owner's name, each expense. She wrote letters by hand to each child. In the letters, she didn't make excuses. She just recounted everything most sincerely, admitting fault not because she did wrong, but because she hadn't known how to maintain fairness. At the end of the letter, she wrote a sentence that makes the reader pause. "I wanted to hold their trust in my hands. I didn't know it could turn to sand." Trust, seemingly intangible, but when lost, leaves a deep, bottomless void. Eleanor no longer had the strength to mend everything, but she understood. From now on, mom should only hold on to love, not hold money for her children. Because feelings can be shared, but money, no matter how much love there is, requires transparency, clarity. A year later, during a family gathering, the eldest daughter timidly sat down next to her mother. She didn't mention the past, just asked, "Are you okay, Mom?" Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. The daughter looked at her mother, then gently said, "I was very angry before, but I understand." "It must have been very difficult for you, Mom." That sentence didn't erase all the cracks, but it was the first step towards healing. Then came the youngest son, then the middle son, each at their own time, also gradually returned to their mother's embrace, not because everything was forgotten, but because they chose to forgive. Forgive, not because someone is perfect, but because in their hearts, there was still a place for that mother. The one who once held too many things in her hands but finally understood. Holding money is not the way to hold a family together. Eleanor no longer holds money for her children. She chose a bank, divided separate accounts, handed back each part to each person. But she still kept the most important thing, a small diary in which she recorded everything she had experienced. For her, it was a way to remember the lesson. For others, it's a mirror to reflect upon themselves. Perhaps you are a father, a mother, or simply a child watching your parents age day by day. Remember, no mistake is unforgivable if love still exists, and no lesson is too late if we still want to understand each other. Eleanor, that elderly woman, may no longer hold the money, but she retained the most important thing, awareness, a profound lesson from seemingly harmless kindness, but if misplaced, can become the pebble that trips an entire family. Lesson 4. Do not compare children to each other. There's a strange thing in every child's memory. No matter how loved you are, small remarks from parents can engrave themselves deeper than hugs, especially when that remark puts you on a scale with your own siblings. In a family, seemingly harmless comparison is like a silent shard of broken glass piercing the heart, leaving a wound that doesn't bleed but aches for a lifetime. Mrs. Eleanor's story is a poignant slice of that, and a lesson many mothers and fathers perhaps only understand when they are near the end of their parenting journey. That day, the lights in Mrs. Eleanor's small house were on earlier than usual. She was preparing a small gathering. Nothing special, just a family meal after a long time of her 3 children being scattered. The eldest son flew in from Boston, the second daughter drove nearly 2 hours from the suburbs, and the youngest daughter had recently moved back nearby after her divorce. The meal was carefully prepared, each dish tied to a specific memory of her children. Fried chicken for the eldest son, bean soup for the middle daughter, and the mixed salad was something the youngest had always liked since college. When everyone was seated around the table, the conversation revolved around work, health, then gradually shifted to personal lives that she rarely heard in full. Then for some reason, perhaps out of swelling pride, Mrs. Eleanor turned to her youngest daughter and smiled gently. This little one, always quietly shouldering burdens, more resilient and capable than the others. She said it lovingly, like praise, the way a mother often saves the sweetest words for the child who has just gone through hardship. But in that moment, her eldest son's eyes flickered slightly. He didn't react, didn't question, just smiled faintly, continuing to serve himself food as if nothing had happened. The meal continued with laughter, but it wasn't as seamless as before. Only later did she remember that something had changed right then. Not in the words spoken, but in the way someone felt unseen, unacknowledged. Mrs. Eleanor was not a mother lacking love. On the contrary, her love for her children was so abundant that unconsciously she always sought one child to lean on, to be proud of, to console herself that, at least I raised them well. And her youngest daughter, with her gentle and quiet nature, became the one upon whom she placed the most emotion in her old age. But what she didn't expect was that these seemingly harmless praises inadvertently made her other two children feel excluded from their mother's heart. After the gathering, she noticed her eldest son called less often than before. He no longer shared much personal news. When they talked, his voice was still warm, still polite, but there was a distance she couldn't bridge. The second daughter was more direct. During a walk, she looked at her mother and asked, "Mom, do you think the youngest is the best among us?" She was startled. "No, I just find her well-behaved, suffering hardships without complaining." "I've suffered hardships too, Mom, you know," she said softly. "I just didn't talk about it." Silence enveloped the two women. Only then did Mrs. Eleanor understand that praise, however true, when compared within a sacred relationship like family ties, can become a double-edged sword. Not because the other child didn't deserve praise, but because the remaining ones also needed recognition, needed to feel that Mom loved them in a unique way, no more, no less. All her life, she had prided herself on being fair to her children. On holidays, she divided gifts equally. When they were young, every shirt, every book was measured for fairness. But as they grew older, what they needed wasn't equal distribution of material things, but emotional understanding, something she had sometimes forgotten. A fair perspective doesn't come from treating everyone the same, but from understanding what makes each child unique and cherishing that as an irreplaceable part. Time passed, and the distances created by those words years ago were not easily erased. Every family gathering, the eldest son often used work as an excuse not to come. The middle daughter still visited her mother, but no longer shared much personal news. And the youngest, on whom she had once placed the most affection, fell into a period of psychological instability after her divorce, leaving her feeling adrift. It was then she realized no child is an absolute pillar for parents, just as no one is perfect enough to replace the affection of siblings. One night, lying silently looking at the ceiling, Mrs. Eleanor remembered a sentence she read in a thin book by a psychologist. Each child carries a part of the parent's heart, and no part is the same. Love is not comparison, but the acknowledgement of each individual. At that moment, tears fell, not out of regret, but from realizing she had loved her children with a true heart, but sometimes expressed it wrongly. She began to change, not with direct apologies, but through small actions. In calls, she inquired about each child with deeper listening. She stopped mentioning the youngest as a role model. Instead, she recounted beautiful memories with each child. She sent her eldest son an article he had written with a note, "Mom has always been proud that you are a person of depth." She texted her middle daughter, mentioning the time she cut short her vacation to care for Mom after minor surgery, and said, "Not everyone could do that. Thank you, dear." These small gestures didn't immediately erase the hurt, but they were the first step in mending each crack, each seemingly unbridgeable gap. She understood that fairness lies not in praise, but in genuine presence. She didn't need to choose which child to be proud of, because the very existence of each child in her life, with all their differences, was already a pride beyond measure. Time taught her that lesson through the most seemingly ordinary moments. A sad look during a meal, a pause between sentences, a time a child was silent for too long when she accidentally mentioned someone else. All like quiet bass notes, teaching her that being a mother isn't just about loving, but also learning to love in the right place, at the right time. The last sentence she wrote in her diary after a birthday with all her children present, imperfect, but a day she felt forgiven, was, "Having 3 children means 3 chances to understand myself more deeply. None are alike, and therefore, each is an unrepeatable miracle." Perhaps for many this lesson comes too late, but for Mrs. Eleanor, though late, it still arrived, and it was enough for her to live the rest of her life with a lighter heart, having understood what not every mother realizes in time. Comparison doesn't create love. Only empathy can nurture it long term. Lesson 5. Know how to let go and live for yourself. There are quiet afternoons when the late-day sun streams through the window frame, casting long shadows on the old wooden floor, where a woman stands alone in an empty house. The laughter and chatter of children have faded into memory. Family meals are now just single plates on the table. And in that moment, amidst the silence and sighs, a mother realizes, her whole life, she lived for everyone, except herself. That was Mrs. Eleanor, the woman who spent her youth building a home, raising children, sustaining a marriage of over 30 years, only to find one day she no longer had a place in the very life she had created. Not because someone pushed her out, but because she herself had placed herself on the periphery, prioritizing everyone else first. The day Mrs. Eleanor decided to return to her old house after her children were settled, no one said it, but everyone understood. She wanted to live alone. No more calls of mom each morning, no more afternoons waiting for children to come home for dinner, no more nameless chores from dawn till dusk. The old house, once crowded with children's laughter, now only held the sound of wind rustling through the trees and her footsteps echoing in empty rooms. Initially, the emptiness overwhelmed her. Many times she sat silently by the window, hands fiddling with a half-finished knitted scarf, tears quietly falling for no clear reason, just out of longing. Longing for the way her youngest son used to demand bedtime stories, longing for the silent gaze of her middle daughter during wordless arguments, even longing for the exhaustion of soothing, caring, sacrificing, all now just memories. But then, after many months submerged in that loneliness, something within Mrs. Eleanor began to change. Not quickly, not loudly, but gently, like a flower blooming at dawn. She started taking walks every morning, slowly strolling down the tree-lined path in front of her house. One day she stopped before the small garden long overgrown with weeds. As if by reflex, she began pulling out weeds, turning the soil, planting small flower beds, chrysanthemums, lavender, dahlias. Every morning, she watered the plants, talking to the pots as if they were close friends. And in those simple movements, she felt her heart soften. She also retrieved old paintings she had done when she was young. It had been years since she held a brush, mixed colors, allowed herself to be immersed in her own world of color. In the small room under the soft yellow light, she repainted memories, emotions, and sometimes even the voids she never had the chance to name. One day visiting the town library, she was invited by a staff member to join a book club for seniors. Initially, she declined, thinking she didn't need to socialize. But out of curiosity, she tried attending one session. And in that small room filled with old books, she rediscovered laughter long lost. Gentle conversations, profound sharings from peers taught her something. Everyone has sacrificed, lost, loved, and let go. And in that empathy, she felt her heart heal. From these small activities, Mrs. Eleanor gradually came back to life. No longer just a mother, a wife, or a homemaker, she was herself. A person with emotions, hobbies, unfinished dreams, and the right to live for herself. One spring day, while rearranging her bookshelf, she found an old faded diary. Her hurried writings from years ago, containing sadness, unspoken desires, and sometimes invisible resentment towards her own life. She reread it, then picked up her pen again, this time not to vent, but to recount her journey of rediscovering herself. The idea for her first video came naturally. She placed a simple camera on the table, sat before a cup of tea, and recounted the days gone by. No special effects, no loud background music, just a warm voice, gentle eyes, and the story of a mother who had lived almost her entire life learning to love herself. What she didn't expect was that the video, less than 10 minutes long, would be shared by hundreds, then thousands. Mothers, grandmothers, middle-aged women, and even young people, all found a piece of their own story in Mrs. Eleanor's narrative. Someone commented, "Thank you for voicing what I couldn't say." Another wrote, "Ma'am, watching this made me cry. I'm forgetting myself too." Moved by this response, she began sharing more regularly. Not for fame, but for connection. She talked about gardening, about overcoming empty days, about newly finished paintings, even about days filled with unexplained sadness. She became a small but inspiring figure in the senior community. A living testament that age cannot stop someone from starting over. And then miracles began to happen. Her eldest daughter called for the first time after nearly 2 months of silence, her voice hesitant. "Mom, I saw your video. I'm sorry I never asked if you were okay." Then the middle son sent a long message, talking about times he felt his mother was distant without understanding why. Finally, all 3 children came to visit Mom over the weekend, the first time after months of only superficial contact. During dinner that evening, no one blamed anyone. No one brought up past misunderstandings. Only laughter, gentle touches, and eyes that seemed to say, "We are still a family." Seeing her children off, Mrs. Eleanor no longer felt the sadness of previous partings, because this time, she wasn't waiting for someone else to fill the void inside her. She had filled it herself. When asked what helped her change, she simply smiled and said, "I let go of them to find myself, and somehow they found me back." A short sentence, yet it contained a long journey. She let go not because she stopped loving, but because she understood that true love doesn't mean imprisonment, sacrifice, or waiting in vain. True love is when we are brave enough to step out of the roles others assign us, to look back at ourselves, to live fully each moment, whether anyone is beside us or not. Mrs. Eleanor wasn't special. She represents millions of mothers, women who forgot themselves while fulfilling roles in life. But that's precisely why her story is so moving, because it's real, simple, and full of hope. Because sometimes life's greatest lesson comes not from success, not from others teaching us, but from the moment we dare to return to ourselves and say, "I deserve to live a happy life for myself." And then the greatest miracle comes from that very act of seemingly letting go. When we let go, it's not loss. It's opening up space for love to return. That is the gift Mrs. Eleanor found after a lifetime. Being herself, living fully and peacefully. And when that happened, not only did she find herself, but her loved ones also found her, in the most beautiful, radiant version of a mother who learned to love herself before loving others. Have you ever thought, maybe you too need such a step of letting go? Some moments don't need to be loud to touch the deepest part of the heart. And that morning, in the sun-filled house of a small town, Mrs. Eleanor stepped out of her room wearing a pale cream dress, her silver hair neatly tied back, her eyes shining with quiet gentleness. Today was her 80th birthday. In the living room, her children were awkwardly arranging cake, balloons, and old photos printed from faded memories. A year ago, they were still silent with each other, no one initiating messages, no one knowing exactly how their mother was living after leaving the shared home. Yet today the 3 stood together, gathered in a small room, preparing for the woman they had always thought was too strong to need anyone. The atmosphere felt slightly strange, as if everything familiar from the past was now being weighed to see what remained, what had changed. But no one spoke of it. Instead, they let things unfold naturally, as if the gentle silence itself was the most necessary thing on this special day. When the birthday cake was brought out, and the flickering candlelight reflected on Mrs. Eleanor's wrinkled face, she just smiled softly, a smile not radiant but full of peace. No one rushed to sing. No one urged her to make a wish. They just looked at each other, then at her, with a respect that might have been lacking before. One of the children gently invited her to reread a diary entry they had stumbled upon when they arrived early to prepare. Mrs. Eleanor sat down in her familiar armchair, opened the worn leather-bound notebook, turning to a page with a folded corner. Her voice was warm and deep, unwavering despite the age etched into every breath. As parents, we all want to give, but when we know how to keep a little for ourselves, we can truly be there to love them longer. The room fell utterly silent. The children who once ran noisily through this house were now adults, carrying their own lives, their own scars, and even misunderstandings never resolved. But today, hearing her read those words, each of them seemed to understand something they had overlooked for years. Not everyone has the courage to let go of the role that has defined them for nearly a lifetime. Mrs. Eleanor had been the mother the whole family relied on, a great shadow of sacrifice. But one day she chose to leave, not to escape, but to rediscover a part of herself long forgotten. The part that loved nature, painting, writing in a diary every night, and quietly joining a book club every Saturday. The part that was Eleanor, not just someone's mother. And that very act of letting go, which seemed like an end, became a beginning. No one expected that the first video she made, recounting her life story in minutes, would touch the hearts of thousands of seniors, people who had lived for others to the point of exhaustion, who felt lost in their own homes. She was no longer just the mother of 3 children. She became a voice, an inspiration for a community learning to love themselves again. After the diary entry, she closed the notebook, looking at each child. No blame, no demands. But in her eyes there was something heart-wrenchingly gentle, as if everything had truly been forgiven long ago. No apologies needed, no long conversations required, just one return and a hug tight enough. One of the children, the eldest son, stood up, placed a hand on his mother's shoulder, and said softly, "I'm sorry I didn't understand you sooner, Mom." The youngest daughter, flustered, wiped away tears, nodding instead of speaking. The middle son, the quietest one, just smiled faintly, then pulled his chair closer to his mother. The birthday party proceeded gently. No unfamiliar guests, no expensive gifts, just the warm sound of laughter among 4 people who had once been separated by the invisible distances of expectation and disappointment. As dusk fell, the house returned to quiet, but this time the quiet no longer carried a feeling of emptiness. It was the quiet of something newly healed. Mrs. Eleanor saw her children off to their cars. Before closing the familiar wooden door, she turned back to look at the house. That place over the past year had become where she came back to life, not just survived. And now, even though her children had returned, she knew clearly things would never be the same. But perhaps they didn't need to be the same anymore. Some returns aren't about starting over, but about continuing, differently, more maturely, more forgivingly, and more gently. The video ended with an image of Mrs. Eleanor looking out at the garden, where new shoots were just emerging from the earth after a long winter. Sometimes, when we pause to take care of ourselves, those who love us will also find their way back. And so hundreds, thousands of viewers quietly closed that video in the night with teary eyes and light hearts.